The chapter or lesson is entitled today, The World in Need of a Story. We've tried to share with you thus far certain principles about evangelism. We tried to share with you that people are probably more open to talk to you than you are willing to probably talk to them, because 78% of people say they're open to a spiritual discussion. We then tried to share with you about story and the power of what a story can do, how a story can move you, even if it's not true. But then we tried to share with you, well, why does that happen? It's because our brains are wired for story, and God created us that way. And this is setting us up then for this lesson here, is the world is in need of a larger story. The world is in need of a story that can explain the individuals that are in this world, what's going on in life. Erwin McManus made an interesting statement. He said, whoever tells the best story shapes the culture. And that's kind of scary, isn't it? Whoever tells the best story shapes the culture. Our world needs a story that's bigger than themselves, that can explain how it all began, can explain humanity and what's gone wrong. We need a story that offers hope, and we also need a story that tells what's going to happen in the future. As you see in your notes in the verse blank, is that everyone has adopted some sort of story as a narrative for life. Whoever you may engage with in discussion, they've adopted some type of narrative that gives them explanation for their existence, their meaning, and their purpose. Most of the time, as you engage these people, it's a false narrative. But they've had to have adapted something that helps explain their life and the world in which they live. Your second blank says, we need a story, though, that explains life. At the bottom of your page, you'll find a quote by an atheist, John Paul Sartre. And I want you to notice a certain phrase in this quote here. He says, at the end of his life, he says, I find it difficult to cling to my atheist worldview anymore because it has no explanatory power. Maybe pragmatic help for a certain situation, but no long-term help. How sad. Atheist John Paul Sartre, at the end of his life, he said, listen, his world story had no explanatory power. We need to be able to explain to people that there's one story that governs the world. And this is God's story. And God's story has explanatory power. It has the power to explain how it all began, where in the world we came from. It has the power, this has the explanatory power to explain where humanity came from and the beauty of the world, the brokenness that we have inside, and why I think and I do certain. I need some type of story that explains why I am the way I am. And every morning, we all get up with some type of hope within our soul that will help us make it throughout the day. And we need a story that gives legitimate hope, that explains hope, and it's valid. And deep within our hearts, we all want, whether we're at a movie or reading a book, we want that book or movie to end right, because there's something in our soul that says, listen, we want the end of the narrative to end the way it's supposed to. And this world needs a story that explains the future. And I would want to submit to you that it's only God's story that is coherent. And as someone said, it's the only coherent, compelling story that there is. This world is in need of a story. Your friends are in need of a story. And let me share with you what actress Demi Moore said. And many of you are familiar with her and how wealthy and famous she is. She said this, what scares me is that I'm ultimately going to find out at the end of my life that I'm not lovable, that I'm not worthy of being loved, that there's something just fundamentally wrong with me. Demi Moore is in need of a better story than this. Actor Jim Carrey, the man who is a comedian, gets a lot of laughs. He said this, I hope everybody could get rich and famous and will have everything they've ever dreamed of, so they will know it's not the answer. Wow. I think that Jim Carrey is in need of a better story. Steve Jobs passed away, the founder of Apple, which all of us use their devices. He said this before he died: I'd like to think that something survives after you die. It's strange to think you accumulate all this experience and maybe a little wisdom, and it just goes away. So I really want to believe something survives, that maybe your conscience endures. But on the other hand, perhaps it's like an on-off switch. Click. You're gone. Maybe that's why I don't like to put on-off switches on Apple devices. Demi Moore, Jim Carrey, Steve Jobs, all need a better narrative for life. Interesting story about a former professor at Princeton University named Émilie Calais. Émilie Calais grew up in France in a very naturalistic world, and he never even saw a Bible to the age of 23. He went off to World War I, and a man who was a skeptic, and he was in a foxhole with a friend, and that friend was shot and died right in front of him. Really shook him up. What's the meaning of life, purpose of life? And as he would go on and spend nights in those foxholes, he began to think, I've got to find a book that would really understand me. My meaning, my purpose, the questions I have for life. Well, he didn't really have a book that could understand him. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little leather journal and I'm going to compile a book myself. And when I read something about life or how it applies to me, that really I'm going to cut it, paste it out, put it in this book. And then I'm going to compile it. And finally, I'll have a day when I open it up, and this will be the book that finally understands me. And then I quote, he says, the day came when I put the finishing touch to the book that would understand me, speak to my condition, and help me through life's happening. It was a beautiful sunny day. I went out, sat underneath a tree, and opened my precious anthology. As I went on reading, however, a growing disappointment came over me. Instead of speaking to my condition, the various passages reminded me of their context, of the circumstances, of my labor over their selection. Then I knew the whole undertaking would not work, simply because it was of my own making. It carried no strength of persuasion. In a dejected mood, I put the little book back into my pocket. At that very moment, my wife, who incidentally knew nothing of the project on which I had been working, appeared at the garden of the gate pushing a baby carriage. It had been a hot afternoon, and she had followed the main boulevard there in France, and it was really crowded. And she decided she needed to get off the boulevard, and she did. It was on a cobblestone street. And there was a grassy area next to the cobblestone street, so she pushed the baby carriage over that, and she saw that there were some steps that led up to a white building. She made her way up there, and she realized it was a part of a church building, hidden away. And she approached it, and there was a gentleman who was the pastor there, and she walked up to the desk, and she heard herself saying, "Have you a Bible in French?" He smiled to her and eagerly gave one into her hand, and she walked out feeling emotions of joy and guilt. As I now stood in front of her, she meant to apologize, but I had no longer listening to her. "A Bible, you say? Where is it? I've never seen one before." And I took that Bible. I read, and I read. With an indescribable warming search within me, I could not find words to express my all in wonder. And suddenly it was dawned upon me that this was the book that understood me. I continued reading deeply into the night, mostly from the Gospels, and lo and behold, as I looked through them, of the one whom they spoke, the one who spoke, acted them, became alive to me. Emily Clay was looking for a story that would understand him. He thought he could compile it himself. It didn't work. But in these pages of Scripture, he found the story that understood him. Every single person you talk to and engage it, there is only one story that can tell them everything they need to know. And this world is in need of a story that's explained to them, that can answer the most essential questions of life. Where I came from. Do I have purpose? Do I have meaning? What has gone wrong with this world? And is there any hope for me? And what does the future hold? The world is in need of a story. And whoever tells that best story really shapes the culture. I challenge you, and I challenge myself to go into this world and tell them the only story that can understand them.